My name is Brian Sergitz. I'm the Senior Vice President of Huffington Post. I'm the founder of our Impact, Education, Good News sections, also oversee all of our cause-related editorial for the company. And this is my second Skoll. Renee Kaplan, thank you for having me again. And we've worked closely with the Skoll Foundation over the past couple of years, and it's an honor to be here. But I'm humbled to sit on stage with these gentlemen who have dedicated their life to what I didn't realize before was such a profound issue. It was, to me, I grew up with, there was always a light switch, there was always cooked food, there was always gas in the car. Never thought about these conveniences until you start learning about the problems that these, for the Westerners, inconveniences. People never even have opportunity to have access to clean energy or energy at all. And so, happy to be here. I'm going to go through some quick introductions, and then we're going to get to some quick questions. So, to my left is Jim Elliott, who is the founder and CEO of Hybrid Social Solutions. Jim has worked in economic development issues in emerging markets for 29 years in his various roles as a social entrepreneur, CEO as a listed company, management consultant, and trustee of several nonprofit organizations. He believes that business and investment capital have an essential role to play in solving urgent social problems by working in communities and other stakeholders that scale up social innovation at the base of the economic pyramid. Jim is also a Schwab Social Entrepreneur of the Year and Ernst & Young EOY Philippines. Yeah, exactly. I do what you said. I didn't want to say it yourself, so I thought I'd give the abbreviation. And there's an interesting story about working at McKinsey for 20 plus years and then turning back around and decide to help bring millions of people in the Philippines energy. So thank you for being here. To his left, Simon Desjardin, the program manager for the Shell Foundation. Hope you don't mind me going into this. So these guys are going to kill me. Simon runs the Shell's Foundation Access to Energy program, which is the goal of helping to provide access to modern energy services for the poor. Before joining the Shell Foundation in 2008, Simon worked globally in a broad range of businesses and development roles with experience in startups, multinationals, and nonprofit organizations, and we'll go into a little bit more what you do during the panel. Depender, which means, I won't say it. He told me before, but I don't know if that was public knowledge.
Cheap energy.
Cheap energy, exactly. Well, it's energy in some form, but it's like, Sela is the managing director of the Capricorn Investment Group, an investment firm based in Palo Alto. He oversees investments in energy tech, clean tech, IT, and emerging markets. He's also the president and CEO of how do you pronounce it? Automatics, a Capricorn portfolio company developing energy management platforms. And he was chief of staff previously at Candace. And I won't go into the rest of the background. And to his left is Jasjit. Right? Am I pronouncing that correctly? Jasjit. Okay, there we go.
And what does that mean?
Because every Indian name means something, right?
Cheap rural energy.
Cheap.
For everybody.
This is like social impact branding. And you are the executive chairman of Agni. See, I'm pronouncing this all incorrectly. And has helped set up the Omidyar Network, leading early stage VC fund in India. So gentlemen, thank you for being here. Raise your hands, how many people really understand this issue? Like really, do you know the numbers? Do you know how many people know that 1.6 billion people are living without access to energy? Okay, so you know that, right? That's like, let's softball that question. How many here are in the field of energy or venture capital? Raise your hand. So okay, so we're kind of talking a little bit to the choir, and to everyone at home, I'll write a blog about it on Huffington Post, and you can read my stats there later. So when I was looking at this issue and trying to come up with some questions for the panel, it was interesting about how the UN Foundation, not the UN Foundation, but the United Nations in 2012 really took this on as a global issue, and we looked at three things that the goals were: ensuring universal access to modern energy services, doubling the rate of improvement of energy efficiency, and doubling the share of renewable energy in the global energy mix. Now we know that access to energy is central to most challenges in the developing world, but to each one, so I want to start with you, Jim. What trends are you seeing that make you optimistic or pessimistic to reach the goals that the UN has set out by the year 2030? Right. And I'm not going to go into that because, I think everyone here knows.
Yeah. Well, I think when you look at the issue of access for all, right, the technologies now exist where you can have distributed power in rural areas. And so we're seeing a lot of much better products than there used to be at much better costs. And so it's now within reach of poor rural people. The big issue right now is how do you get that distributed and financed and maintained so that it becomes sustainable. But it's on its way, so I think we're close to that point. I look at it a little bit like telephones, right? Used to be we all couldn't live without landlines, right? And even if you had a cell phone, you always had a landline, right? And just like that with power, we're all on the grid, and a few of our things can now be off grid because we have solar chargers and whatever. But I think with the poor, there are many places where the grid's just not going to reach them. Just like landlines will never reach many places.
Right.
But it doesn't matter because they now have cell phones.
Yeah.
So it's going to be the same with distributed power.
Yeah, and Dependent, we were talking about phones when we were prepping for this in regards to the innovation of the phone and how that's even so quickly surpassed anybody's expectations of how that would change communications, just with the cost of a cell phone. How would you compare, actually, using that analogy in terms of what you're seeing now, how we could get to reach these goals by the year 2030?
So I think from a proliferation point of view, Jim's absolutely right that I think there's that analogy there. I think you can extend that analogy further where if you look at the rapid growth of wireless telephony in a place, whether it's Africa or South Asia, in a country like India over 70 years, they put a whopping 45 million landlines for 1 billion people. And over the last dozen years, Carl, they put about, about 960 million, 1 billion cell phones in the last dozen years. And they're adding about 20 million a month. So the speed with which that has happened, I think, could give us a case for what could happen in this space as well. And from a rapid technology development, but the cost curve point of view, the cost curve in the mobile phone has been phenomenal. The cost curve in something like solar has been unprecedented. There is no other source of energy that has come down in price in 10 years in the history of energy. Solar energy has come down 5x in the last 10 years. And so that's just great news for the problems that you're talking about, which is cost and ultimately access.
Is that a combination of subsidies or the free market, sort of the
No,
better product innovation?
It's the result of what started as a beautiful gift to the world by mostly Europe, which led the move to something like solar energy, and then market forces took over, and everybody rushed in to fill that demand. And as often happens in technology cycles, many companies and many countries rushed in to fill that demand, and you ended up with 3 or 4x of the basic demand, and that caused rapid drop in prices. It caused a lot of innovation for people to fill that demand, a lot of innovation to meet those price points, and at this point, that genie is out of the bottle.
So you're confident by the year 2030 that this might be able to be achieved, or is it? What are you seeing now? Are you optimistic or pessimistic?
So I think I'll repeat what Jim said. I think the technology problem is largely getting solved. There'll be lots more technology innovations that will happen, which will help this issue and will continue to help address things. But at this point, I don't think you can stand back and say it's too expensive.
Right.
Especially for those markets, especially for markets where people are already using some form of energy by either burning stuff or diesel or kerosene or your favorite off-grid fuel, if you may.
Right.
Now it's a question of getting it out there, getting it with quality, getting it with speed, and innovating around different things like financing and pay-as-you-go, enabling people who don't have the same wherewithal and resources, who are putting solar in their roof, let's say, in the US or Europe, to replace their existing form of power, but in fact, maybe customers of electricity for the first time in their life.
We were talking yesterday about the actual biomass in terms of being off the grid and being not only capturing energy, but also distributing energy at a low cost. And also for somebody that's on the capital side and financing side, you have an interesting perspective on both, and looking at is capital coming in fast enough and investment fast enough, but also what is working from on the ground and what's scaling. Are you optimistic or pessimistic based on what the goals that the UN set forth for 2030 of what you're seeing?
Absolutely. So let me give you a one-word answer, which is optimistic. But then let me also describe what Agni does, which is it's a company based in rural India, which collects and then converts marginal bio-waste at scale into a biofuel that replaces coal, furnace oil, and other fossil fuels. The fact that it's a very local business model is an important piece to it. Deepinder alluded to, and Jim, I think, alluded to newer business models that are coming in. The technology problem is mostly solved. It's the business and the service model problem that people are working on, and that's what we do over at Agni. In terms of the availability of capital to support models of the type that Agni is, I think there is capital, and you have the right partners at the right stages. I'll use this company as an example, where our investment partners are Capricorn, myself wearing an investment hat from Omidyar Network, and New Enterprise Associates, which is completely commercial capital. And we've had early stage risk capital come in and scale the company from bench to large scale plant. And as we grow on from here, we see other sources of capital come in, whether it's strategics or infrastructure players, or even large multilaterals. And then the next stage from that for us would be subsidized debt. We'd see that leverage and debt play a large role in a model like this. So I think there's abundant capital. There's different sources of capital. It needs to come in at the right stages. And I think in this company, we're seeing that happen.
But there's still a gap in capital, right, in order to achieve these goals, a significant gap in terms of what's needed for funding.
I think there's a gap, Brian, at a macro level. There might be a gap. What's important is that you need to solve a problem at an atomic level, at a unit level, and make sure the unit works. And typically what we see in models like these is that unit may not work, in which case, any gap will be too large. It has to make sense as a business first.
I think that's a very interesting point, right? As you talk about this transition from how power was built and delivered earlier. Large power in the past had the same issue, right? You needed a lot of capital to build a large power plant. You needed capital to build large transmission. You needed capital, for all of that, and that was largely available. What made that easier was that you had a lot of centralized power. You would have a large entity that would own this, building and structure, and whether it was a large coal plant or a nuclear plant or a gas plant. Now, by definition, and by the way, that's a feature, not a bug, a lot of this energy is distributed, just like, again, to your wireless phone analogy. Treating that like a large power plant is possible, and you have to do the same kind of thing from a financing point of view. Do you treat it like a collection of 1,000 sites that make up a large power plant, or do you treat all of these as single small power plants? Right. And then what does that mean for financing? Is it one large entity, or is it an individual, or is it a combination of the two? Right. And then flipping this problem completely upside down, where you say, what largely drove financing were large power purchase agreements, and 20-year contracts that said, this power plant, actually more like 40-year contracts between a utility and a service provider and an energy source. Here it's more of again, back to your cell phone analogy, it's more of somebody's building it for you, and there may be just an individual or a family. Yeah. And what does that mean for financing? And what does that mean 1,000 times over as opposed to one?
And we'll get back to even energy capturing later, because you actually might have energy that you could actually spare to other people. So there's the whole thing of the actual grid being, this sort of virtual grid of people, if they're not using it and they can disperse it distribute it to other places too, if it's going to in certain areas as well. Simon, what's the role of philanthropy in this space? So you have the free markets, you'd have investment coming in from different venture firms, like where these two gentlemen work, that are some of the first adapters in social impact investing. But where does the larger foundation institutions sit with this? Is it in their interest? Is it not in their interest? What are the issues in regards to the problems that they're facing as they're looking to invest in it, but at the same time wondering if it's the best use of their investment dollars? So, like, if you can talk a little bit towards that.
Well, I'll talk about two issues at both ends of the market, but I'll say something first that some on the panel and some in the audience might disagree with, which is that we believe that smart subsidy is still very much required to build the energy market. We're not there yet, and I think when I think about there's certainly a need to, I think a lot of the design issues, a lot of the technology hurdles have in some ways been overcome. There's a lot of work to go, and a lot of that is going to require the kind of risk capital and philanthropic capital which has the kind of risk appetite to take big risk and develop brand new technologies from scratch. And I think, when we think about the market in Germany, for example, Depender, you talked about how solar is becoming super, super affordable. We shouldn't forget that market, that solar industry, has received a massive amount of subsidy over the last few years. There's a reason why that price has come down. And for the same reason that in some ways the microfinance market is now a viable industry, that industry needed about $20 billion of subsidy to get where it was in order for there to be investable opportunities that there are today. So it's easy to think that for larger project finance opportunities, for larger energy businesses, that capital issue is solved. We believe that there's still a need for philanthropic capital to actually innovate at the early end of the market. But on the other end of the market, when we think about the subsector within energy that is delivering small-scale energy products, so solar home systems, solar lanterns, that kind of small-scale intervention, which we believe is going to be part of that energy mix and needs to be. The biggest barrier, interestingly, for those companies to get to scale today is actually working capital. And right now, if you're in India, if you're in Africa, many parts of East Asia, you don't have access unless you have 3, 4, 5 years of operating profitability. You can't go to a bank for a loan. And interestingly, we believe that philanthropic capital and smart subsidies needed to develop financial intermediaries that are specifically dedicated to serve that market. A lot of the discussion tends to be around, well, how do we incentivize banks to lend to that market? We believe that maybe that's the right question for much larger ends of the market, but for small-scale energy products, which is going to be a hugely important subsector, that is not the right question. And in fact, we need to be developing dedicated, focused funds and intermediaries to do that, and that's what we're working on right now.
Sorry, my mic fell off. Can you talk a little bit about the fund that you're setting up now and the role that OPEC and the monies that they've committed? How is that actually allowing other I would say other free market businesses or foundations to come into the space and add to investment?
Right.
That has sort of been able, like to your point, has been like hard to give these companies growing working capital. And I think the good examples of where one of our panelists who couldn't make it talking about, and you cited this actually in your op-ed that came out yesterday for MCOPA, and
right.
in terms of that model of being able to lease that technology and having the ability to at least cover your operating costs. And
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, the issue of working capital is kind of an interesting one. And again, I'm thinking about the energy product market. Most of those products are manufactured in China, 75% of them are. Most of them are sold in the developing world markets. So you need capital to manufacture, simply import into a geography like Africa and distribute. This isn't rocket science, and yet there's no dedicated body to provide that kind of working capital. So the fund that we're working on now, $30 to $40 million, set up specifically to lend to product manufacturers to enable them to unlock that chain. It's not rocket science, and it's meant to be very, very, very vanilla, very simple. So we're a few months away from launching that, and we're hoping that's going to serve the whole market. It started with a pilot with the OPEC fund and Delight, which used to be an Omidyar, or still is an Omidyar Network investee, where we provided that kind of capital in the way of grant, acted like debt, and sold almost 500,000 lights in a period of 18 months, and that's rapidly, and that's continuing to count. So we're working on that. On energy product financing, we think this is the new frontier in that same market. To date, if you wanted to provide a small loan for an individual in the developing world to buy a product like that, you needed to go to an MFI, or microfinance institution. And as many in the room will know, that is a tricky proposition, especially you, Jim. So we were looking for a technology or a model that decoupled consumer finance for energy products from microfinance. And this is where we got excited about this company called M-Copa, which was founded by the same people who developed M-Pesa, which allows you as a consumer to buy a solar home system on installment over the M-Pesa network, entirely decoupled from microfinance. And we believe that's in many ways, a big chunk of the future of consumer financing for energy products, and that showing a huge amount of traction on the ground.
Be interesting to see how even the crowdfunding model applies to that one. You can actually have people around the world helping fund individuals for energy versus a microfinance loan for a business. You know, if you can bring that opportunity based on, context. So you actually can open it up to, different areas throughout the world, and then through, potentially even the Jobs Act, if you're actually, there's the ability for even people to take capital in these new emerging markets and own a piece of that new technology globally, and that's gonna be fascinating to see when that comes out this year.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's could be for this space, could be a game changer depending on when the final rules come down from Washington.
Well, very quickly, that technology, which is GSM embedded technology, which, by the way, the GSMA is working on as well, is applicable to any product with an energy backbone that could be switched on or off remotely. It doesn't have to be a solar home system. So we're excited by the number of applications where that technology applies.
Right. Jim, talk about the hybrid model a little bit, because we've talked from the nonprofit side. We talked about some of the for-profit social impact investment side, but you have an interesting model. How does that work together? Because people sometimes usually would do both, but they don't.
Right.
So how does that work for you?
I guess we start with the markets that we're trying to reach, the consumer segments we're trying to reach. In order to have products available on an ongoing basis where it can be financed and maintained, right? You actually need to create the whole ecosystem and a supply chain, right? And it's not just one. Take the Philippines, for example. We have roughly 50,000 small villages that need electricity. So we actually need something that can go into 50,000 different villages. So by definition, in any given place, you're going to be working with a number of different actors. Some who are closer to the villages, some who are in the supply chain, some who are bringing it in, from China.
So you're on a lot of boats going between the little
Lots
islands,
of
right?
boats. Well, on the islands, we're up in mountains, right? Very interior farming areas.
When you're on the beaches, can you let me know?
Well, we have anyone who wants to do our projects can come with us. We went sailing all over to bring our lights to.
We're having a
different
raffle
islands.
after whoever wants. The Skoll Foundation's paying for that.
So really the challenge is to be able to build the ecosystem to get the products all the way there.
Okay.
Right. So if you think about that, when I worked in corporate life and I used to do real estate, if we wanted to build a building, right, we would just call up the architects, we'd bid it out to a contractor, there would be suppliers, right? We probably involved hundreds of different organizations to build one building. Well, the same thing needs to happen if you're bringing products out to these villages. We need banks, we need, So what we have in place and what we've done with the hybrid network is we actually have for-profit entities. For example, the company that distributes the products. We have a foundation because there is very much a role for smart philanthropy, right? And so you need a foundation for that.
And what does the foundation do specifically in the ecosystem?
Well, they do a number of things. On the ongoing stuff, they're very involved in doing the impact assessments.
Okay.
Right, so the work that we know a lot about our customers because we've been able to source money through the foundation for impact assessments. There's a lot of capacity building that needs to happen. We need to train end users. We need to train partners in terms of being able to do the program.
So what's working in the Philippines, actually? Sorry to interrupt, but we talk, because we're talking about actually different technologies that are applicable. And India might be different than Germany, that's going to be different than different places in the world. How's the Philippines, what's adapting in the Philippines right now?
Well, we're very lucky because we have a wide number of NGOs and people working in the communities, right? And so there is an existing network that we can easily leverage. In any village in the Philippines, there's a lot of good-hearted people, and so there are organizations you can tap into. Our challenge and what we've done is to build a number of models that, depending if you're a cooperative or an NGO or a microfinance organization, that you can work with us where it fits what you're already doing. So we don't try to force something in that doesn't fit, right? We say, what are people already doing and how do we juice that?
Right. Do subsidies play part in terms of actually, I'll ask you this. Is there a lot of pressure from the solar, based on the amount of subsidies that came in, to apply that into places that might not have adapted solar to begin with, or because we've seen the cost of it come down based on the amount of time and money that's gone into it. Is there places where actually people haven't adapted to it, and actually there's other technologies that culturally they might think that works better, like biomass or fuel cells? Are there examples that you've seen in the space, even though it's very scalable at this point, people have rejected it and have actually gone to another source of energy?
People go to whatever energy they can find. I
Right.
mean, if you go to some of these places, they burnt everything in sight for 5 miles, right, or 10 miles, or as far as they can walk. And so people, are doing all sorts of things for the last, century to find energy. I think the subsidies point, was absolutely there. That was part of that gift, if you may,
Yes.
from Europe to the world. Part of the reason for the subsidies for a very long time was that cost differential, right? This quote-unquote pursuit of grid parity. And grid parity in this context means something different. Grid parity, if you compare it to D-cell batteries, is, 1,000 times what somebody traditionally thinks of grid parity as, flip the switch in Utah, or your favorite low-cost power place. You're smiling. Utah actually has one of the cheapest power rates.
Exactly.
We were trying to do a project there.
It's 4,000 times in the
4,000
Philippines.
times. So
The cost per kilowatt hour in a D-cell battery is 4,000 times the grid cost.
it's large, right? It's very large. And
4,000.
and then I think the cost parity, that is probably the most significant and most applicable, is cost parity to something like diesel, which is the fuel of choice today for a lot of people. And maybe that's where I'd like to add to the conversation is, I think providing lighting has been a great sort of effort on the part of a lot of people. That also took a very long time. While there are still many people without light, that genie is also out of the bottle. People have understood what lighting products need to be. There'll be the normal evolution. There'll be the normal, innovation,
like
etc.
the socket ball we can play with, and kids
That's
can
right.
actually plug it in,
But-
go home,
But people are doing it successfully.
Right.
In fact, now a lot of the innovation will be actually in the lighting itself, because by definition there's a source of power, there's a source for storing the power, and then there's the light bulb itself, and there's innovation happening across that continuum. I think where you start seeing interesting problems now and people moving or adding to is power for getting stuff done. So for productivity, for running machines,
for jobs, like things that are going to create
for
jobs.
things that are jobs, productive commercial applications, and that requires a different level of innovation. It requires, instead of one light, a refrigerator or a house or a factory or a pump or a clinic or a retail outlet, etc. And now you're talking about something that is significantly larger than a light bulb, and then up from there, if you may, whether you power small villages or small cities. There are cities today that are almost entirely powered on diesel. So I think parity to diesel becomes relevant. And the good news is many of these innovations today have brought the price point better than, close to, equal to diesel in many, many places, better than diesel in a lot of places when you factor in things like transportation and using this stuff.
Right.
So that's where I think the market grows orders of magnitude larger. And that's where the need for having the landline equivalent of the phone becomes obsolete.
Right.
Because you get energy to be able to be truly distributed at every level of scale.
And are we seeing the rate, kind of like what happened with the phone, with energy right now, or are we too soon? Are we right before it's going to happen, in your opinion?
My guess is you're seeing that rate in lighting.
Lighting, yes, definitely.
And now you start we've seen that rate in applications such as cell phone towers, and now you'll start seeing that rate in retail or clinics, et cetera. Now the need for capital for that scale, I mean, Simon talked about the need for capital for lighting. The need for capital for that scale is, again, orders of magnitude larger. But it's a very profitable business. It's very self-sustaining, and is a very exciting area to look
And you
at.
continue to invest in that in Capital Corner.
That's right. That's one of our biggest themes right now.
Tech, right. And is there anything sort of like where you're working on with biomass? Are you seeing that scale more quickly than, say, solar in places? In India right now, like where it's being applied to provide the power that's needed to power, to have enough power to have for job creation that's around for people to live, to power heavy machinery, et cetera. What are you seeing right now in terms of how fast people are adapting to that right now? Because people were burning stuff before, or it was on more dirtier types of form of energy.
Sure. No, Brian, the size of the problem and the size of the opportunity are both humongous. Yes. So in the business model that we're operating over at Agni, there's 17 million metric tons of rice straw alone that gets grown per crop season in the state, and the bulk of it gets burnt. And when it gets burnt, it despoils the environment, and it affects the topsoils, et cetera. And then from a demand perspective, what we produce, which is 30 million tons a year, is the rated capacity of a single plant that we run. It accounts for only about 2.5% of the total energy requirement in that very small energy radius that we're working in, 50 to 100 kilometers. And so in terms of demand, it's, the analogy I sometimes use is it's like the freeways in Los Angeles. You could build out twice or thrice the level of freeways in Los Angeles, and you'd still have them chock-a-block with cars because the latent need is so incredibly high. Yeah. What this does is that it opens up productive places for energy to be used beyond the house, so that you have a general economic growth in the area. And so the big power plants or the big industries will figure out one way or another to get power, and they get it from sources like ours, but also traditional sources like coal and fossil fuels and so forth. At the very retail level, you'll figure out something or the other to light your house, or something or the other to make your day-to-day living work. That in-between industry, which is essentially the lifeblood of all the people who are out there, that's severely depressed because of lack of energy. What we're doing out here by encouraging energy democracy and better delivery of energy into those areas is that you're really igniting the opportunity that people run businesses starting from pumps all the way up to small manufacturing units, and they don't have to factor in instability in energy as part of their equation, which they absolutely have to do in places like India, China, I imagine Philippines and other places.
One thing I wanted to add to that, which just occurred to me, one of the statistics that I saw was there's 1 billion medical centers in the world without access to electricity. 1 billion, right? And those centers, particularly in third world countries, are actually source of industry in a way. Their jobs, they create jobs. People come from all around to be treated, but yet there's 1 billion of them without proper electricity, operating without electricity. And I haven't thought about it before we were talking, but is that a way to bring investment into the space where you can actually have to start with a medical center, something that's off the grid, where investment can come into an area quicker as opposed to in the space overall, show that it works, show that it's scalable? Have you seen anything like that happen where we're going to put solar on this one medical center so people can come from around and get treated properly and provide jobs and then be able to scale that?
Yeah, that's a very popular theme. And again, it goes back to parity, right? In that situation, you have another parity, which is what is the cost of getting those vaccines? People are spending millions of dollars to get the stuff there, and then they count on a certain amount of spoilage or a certain amount of product that'll just not work because there is no cold chain, for example. So I think you're bringing one example, which is where the value of the energy is higher than just, let's say, even the diesel that it's replacing in some ways, because the criticality of that energy is higher, right? And I think you can layer that in. Then you've got the food processing industry, you've got the dairy industry. The dairy industry, again, to pick a number, I think in a place like India, it's something like a $70 billion industry, and the old percentage of about 30% of it just spoils, like most ag products. Right there is a $20 billion opportunity. That's not peanuts.
I'll add an example. In India, we have something called brick kilns, where clay is converted into brick, and people use these sort of sintered clay as bricks. Just that brick kiln market alone, everything that we produce or we expect to produce going forward in a rural catchment area would completely be consumed by a part of the brick kiln market alone. That's the level of energy requirement and energy scarcity you have there right now.
To me, there's no need to I think we're all familiar with the different applications for power, but in our view, there's no need to get complicated about this. There's no need necessarily to pair a particular application to a source of energy. We believe that it's almost a if you build it, they will come world, where if you do something, if you're generating power in an efficient, effective way, the market will find you. If you're developing a product that is high quality and affordable, your customers will find you. And if you haven't heard about Agni yet, you should, because what they're doing is using a technology that isn't brand new, but they're doing it at a scale in an execution model on the ground, which is just highly effective, right? I think in many ways there isn't a need to reinvent the wheel every time we do something. We set up a new business, but anybody who's been to rural Africa or India or the developing world, that market for energy is like slapping you in the face. There is no need to pair it to necessarily a particular application. But you're right, Brian. I mean, the opportunity for general socioeconomic development, whether it's healthcare, education applications, transport applications, or just small businesses in general, is massive.
So just one example of, let's say, big business, the major energy companies, or major financial institutions. Where do they play a role in this? Where this opportunity, where there are just as you said, the ability for the market to dictate that scale. Where are they in regards to investment? Why is there such a gap, I would say, between the money coming in from, say, bigger institutions into the space? Why haven't they gone in sooner, or are they sort of waiting and then they'll just sort of acquire small technology, these companies, and then help them scale at a certain point? The example we were talking about was Tesla, that was doing something innovative, came up quick, people did not expect it. All of a sudden, certain companies took a position in the company, helping them with manufacturing and scaling that, and now was it 4 times more valuable than you said, the Chrysler? Was that the
Probably even more by now.
Yeah. Exactly, as of this morning. But again, what are you seeing?
Sure.
And what could be done to actually get that? I would say more investment in the space where the opportunities are potentially endless, and then.
Sure. Well, part of it is it's kind of boring, but there's a perception of risk amongst traditional financial institutions that, in our view, isn't entirely founded. It's going to take them a long time to catch up. To a lot of traditional banks or financiers, what the kind of technologies that Jasjit and others are deploying sounds kind of exotic, and they don't have a long history of financing those sort of things. So often it takes time for those guys just to understand that the market is viable, and we need the Capricorns of the world and in some cases the Shell Foundations of the world to start with that financing. But they will catch up. To me, it's a question of ensuring that the market becomes not a collection of pilots or a collection of one-off successes in a geography A or B, but when you start having multiple companies in the same subsector that are successful, that helps everybody.
Right. And so in the UN's role in this going, because we have 17 years and 1.6 billion people to go, what, is it, again, do you feel that actually they'll come in and that will actually help it increase, we'll be able to expedite, we'll be able to get there by that time? Or do you feel we're gonna be sitting at that around that time and there'll still be a billion people without access to clean, to clean energy?
By the way, I'd add as an example to Simon's risk issue. So without naming names, one of the largest US banks, the guy who's responsible for energy financing there, a few weeks back told me that solar financing is a $40 billion business for them, and it is their most profitable business across the bank. And this bank is into everything you can imagine. And I said, why aren't more people getting into it? And he said, perceived risk is much higher than the actual risk, and those of us who figured that out are making a lot of money doing it. And I think that's eventually, hopefully, going to get there and become.
I'd also add that I think as you get into distributed power, as you go into sort of more outlying areas, by definition you're going more and more small retail or working with micro SMEs, right? So I think what happened in financing with microfinance is very analogous. You don't see large retail banks going in and offering loans to small farmers because you need a very different business model to be able to deliver financing. Right? And so I think it's going to be the same with energy. Most of the energy paradigms are around large capital, large scale, centralized power. Right? So as you start going into this, what you really need are lots of entrepreneurs. Right? The guy who's going to buy 200 lanterns and rent them out in the markets at night. Right? Now he needs a loan, right? And he needs a 5-year loan. Right? And so you need to have banks that will back that entrepreneur so that he can buy 200 lanterns to put into street vendors every night. So it's a very different, so I think that's the evolution needs to be in terms of the support infrastructure to enable entrepreneurs and businesses to run in this kind of sector.
And I think you need to just,
please.
I think you need to take that analogy against the whole continuum. I think Jim's lantern example is absolutely right, and I think you go all the way up to how do farmers buy tractors today? And what is the sort of tractor equivalent of financing for energy? And then, how does somebody finance a rice mill today in the middle of nowhere, or an ice plant, etc. Right? And it's that whole continuum, right? And my point here is, it's lighting, it's tractors, it's ice plant equivalent, it's the mill equivalent, and it's the factory equivalent, right?
So what are sorry, you were going to say something.
Yeah, no. Just going to respond to your question. You've asked it a couple of different ways now. The 2030 1.6, are we going to get to it? So the short answer is yes, and I'll channel Mohammed Yunus from last night in saying, he spoke about the science fiction piece and the social fiction piece. So the science fiction is the technology equivalent in terms of solutions that we're coming up with, and quite a few of these solutions are already out there or aren't overly complicated in getting to. If anything, the key lies in being able to bring them in and make them appropriate for local settings. It's the social fiction piece that we're talking about, which in this situation translates to business model innovation and service model innovation. So if you have that independence, that formalizing the off-grid, if you will, with business model and service model innovation, allows you to siphon in science and technology at that level, and you start making a dent on that 1.6 very, very rapidly.
Okay. So you're confident that how far we are in terms of I think the numbers that I saw was like 9 billion versus the 40 billion that's needed in order to basically achieve those numbers, and there's a gap. There's a 75% gap in that funding for scale. You feel that actually the free markets are going to come in and sort of fill that gap quickly based on the innovations in the space. Is that correct?
Not just that, the social fiction part as well. Right. The newer business models, the newer service models, the understanding that actual risk is different than the perceived risk.
Okay.
It'll happen very quickly.
What could I would say people here or even the media companies do to help with the sort of perceived risk, or do they not want us, to your point, to even talk about it because there's a lot of more profit quietly being invested. I mean, because so if the risk goes down, perceived risk, does that even hurt too? So
I think we're nowhere near anybody hurting anything. I mean, the scale is just phenomenal, right?
Okay.
If you add up all the numbers while we're on alphabet soup, right? If you add it up between Asia and Africa, it's 150 gigawatts and counting. That's twice the amount of power that France generates. Somewhere close to that. We're talking about 200 nuclear power plants that are not going to show up anywhere anytime soon. It's a huge amount,
right?
And the opportunity is huge. So I think every bank needs to have that perceived risk is larger than the actual risk.
Maybe what would help there a little bit is and you ask about how folks who are writing about the space could help, and folks like Huffington Post and others is. I would love to see fewer articles about, Joe Bloggs uses a light to study at night. Right. Because it comes across as this market is about, it feels like it's a charity market. And it feels like the whole point of this is social impact. I would love to see more articles about the financial viability of businesses and the financial opportunity that exists out there. And to me, that's where the social impact here is a derivative of the financial success of what companies are doing in this space. It isn't the purpose. And I think if more stories start coming out about companies that are actually doing well financially and serious investors who are putting serious money behind companies in that space and those companies doing well, that is far more effective in my view to build the market than specific, more human stories about the application. It sounds counterintuitive, but I think that's actually, it might not be what people want to read about. But
No, we talk about the difference, even at Huffington Post Impact all the time, the difference between an empowerment story of an individual versus poverty porn, right, which is literally selling on the sadness and the despair of people.
Oh, yeah, and we get questions a lot like, can we measure how customers are using energy in the developing world? That's like walking out in Oxford here and asking somebody how they use daylight. Somebody might just look at them and, somebody would look at you and just say, what are you talking about? The question here is how do we do this in a financially viable way with technologies that we know?
I think one way to look at it is because we've been talking a lot about the need and if for energy at different levels and how large an investment opportunity that is. If you flip it around and you look at it from the perspective of people who will be using that energy and what it does to their livelihood or their kind of economic well-being, it's enormous, right? If you just take light, and a lot of the articles have been about kerosene replacement or kids studying, right? A single light, right? What we've found in our work enables people to increase their household income by 25%, right? And that's it's fishermen using it to save on kerosene because they use lights to attract fish, right? The kerosene uses up 40% of their take-home pay, right? It's about $7 a night, right? So if you take $7 a night times 30 days, right? That's $200 per month that they could be saving by using solar, right? Now the thing is, you now need to develop solar products for fishermen. Right, and so if you go to a lighting store, you see hundreds or thousands of different lights, right? So why do we think that the D-Light light will solve all of these problems, right? And the thing is that it doesn't. It's a great product for household use, but it's not bright enough to attract fish. You need closer to 200 lumens. It needs to be operating for 10 hours at night, right? You need a certain color spectrum, and you need it to go to a certain depth, right? And it has to be waterproof. Right, the typical D-Light light is not an IP65 product, and so it's not waterproof enough, right? And so this is kind of where you need to start going. You say, what is the market for light beyond just household reading applications, but like livelihood applications? We have farmers who use flashlights in order to spot bats that are eating lychees. Right? They're typically losing about 40% of their crop to fruit bats, right? So we have one farmer who used it to drive away bats, right? And by driving away the bats, they improved their yield, and they were able to buy a motorcycle, right? They credit that motorcycle to that one light. Now that's just one light. Imagine if we now have motors, we have ice plants, right? If a fisherman has ice, right? The dynamics of power in terms of the value of his crop changes completely, right? Because right now he's at the mercy of the buyer because his fish is going to rot by the next day. But if he can put it on ice, he's got now a lot more power, right? So we're getting fishermen together to build ice plants, right? And if they don't have an ice plant, they have to dry their fish. Right? If you don't sell it into the fresh market, you have to dry it, right? And a fresh fish versus a dried fish costs 3 times more, right? And so that, so all of that is possible, and there are business models possible, but you have to organize a cooperative, get somebody to finance it, right? And all of it. So I think, again, that's where the innovation is going to be. Now, apply that now to access to computers, or in fact, not even computers, tablets or cell phones, which use a lot less power, but enable students or fishermen or farmers to have access to critical information.
As the investor in Delight, I'm taking notes to self out here for product innovation. But in a certain way, I buy Simon's point, which is that it's as much about that individual light, et cetera, as it is about small, medium, and yet larger industry in those local areas. It's the ice plant, it's the local rolling mill, the rice mill, the distillery, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the ones that we see that are energy starved right now, and they're holding back growth in the local area, and it's the impact that has on overall GDP growth, which is a massive topic of conversation in a country like India right now. And that's because you don't have growth being supported by a big belt in the middle. The very large industries figure out ways, and at the very lowest level, it's a story that's easy to empathize and to connect with. There's a middle level out there, which is typically the backbone, industrial backbone of any country, which in places like India and a few other countries is sorely lacking energy, and that needs to be juiced up.
Okay. How are we doing time? 5 minutes. So for the last 5 minutes before we get to questions, I want to ask each of the panelists a little bit of a personal question in regards to why this space and why you do what you do, which I think drives a lot of reasons why you do, why we do anything. Can you start in terms of why energy poverty, why even why biomass, and why India?
Oh, that's quite simple. 3. I'm a cleantech engineer by training, farming background, and being an investor, and I'm an Indian. So put it all together.
There we go.
Keep it simple. For us, we're investors in a variety of things, and renewable energy is one of our biggest themes today, and we've been very excited about the work that's gone on there. You mentioned Tesla. Tesla has been an amazing success for our group, and was another great example of, for years, the vision of an electric car was that golf cart that, every time you flipped on the heater would chug up a hill at half the speed of walking or something like that, right? And every time Top Gear had a slow day, they would make fun of the electric car. And so, here you have a few years of innovation, and nobody can contest that it's a better mousetrap. It's the best car on earth, and it is, creating one of the most valuable companies in the world. And I think this space is that combination again of that same thing, which is there's an opportunity to build several multi-billion-dollar enterprises in this space across the chain, and there's the opportunity to impact billions of people around the world at every level. This is sort of the easiest thing to go do.
And why are you involved personally?
Well, I mean, one, to be as simple as his answer, it's my job. But I see that opportunity, that convergence of technology and need and business model is right there.
Okay.
Yeah, building on that, I guess to me what's personal about this is I think that energy and everything to do with energy, climate change, and poverty are the 2 big issues facing my generation today. And we either get that right or we're dead, literally. And so what I want to do is get involved in one or both of those issues in some meaningful way to help crack it. And we think about the root causes, and to echo Muhammad Yunus last night in this idea of imagining what the social fiction of is a world where everybody has access to energy. there are no good reasons why that can't happen. Even today, the technology is there, the market is there, and you heard today on the panel, it's like this is not a question about, can we discover a new technology that might solve this problem? We're having a discussion here about, financing, basic financing, and how do we get capital to the right parts of the market? This is not, rocket science. And so, to me, what's exciting personally about being in this space is that we can see the end game. And I agree with you, Jasjit. I fully agree that these big UN goals are going to get met. I think the market's going to surprise us. And it's exciting to be in a space where we know it's going to happen. We just have to go out and do it.
Jim?
I guess for me, it's been, it was always put in my heart quite early that, and maybe it's my Jesuit school upbringing where we're taught to be a man for others. My father was a civil servant who, on his deathbed, told us kids that in addition to taking care of each other and getting a good education, we should go home and serve our country. Right? And so we all went abroad and then, but we're all home. And so I guess for me, the question has always been, well, how? Right? What's the way to do it? And for me, growing up in the Philippines, I've always felt, we're the laggard in Asia, right? We haven't been able to get our act together. You see all the other Asian countries moving up, and yet we're stuck in this. And it's just a crying shame because the potential is there. So a lot of this is about, kind of me trying to say, well, how do we enable the Filipinos to achieve their full potential, right? And we cannot rely on the public institutions because that's a big part of the problem, right? They're just broken. And so it's got to be more through kind of individual, efforts. And where's that point of leverage and what am I interested in? And I think as we've been talking about, you enable people to have energy, access to energy, right? And it's the key that will allow a lot of things to happen, right? And the markets will come, right? As long as you provide the energy. And at McKinsey, I was actually head of the energy practice, right? And my upbringing was electrical engineering, and I love gadgets. so it's a great sector, and as I've been getting into it, I see it every single day what that change is enabling, right? And so it's something that I feel very strongly about bringing as many people into the sector because we need lots of people.
Okay, great. Wanted to open it up for questions now. Thank you, gentlemen.
So Brian, when are we going to see the next headline in the Huffington Post? Bats and fish spread rumors that perceived risk in solar is higher than...
I'm going to get right into it just right during the QA, actually. We'll have it up on the front page, but yes, sir.
I almost never find myself the pessimist in a session like this, but I'm going to be slightly challenging.
Please.
Yes, I think the problem of light can be solved by the market. But the problem of power, to my knowledge, real universal access has never been achieved in any large society without one or another form of debt de-risking by the government, either cross-subsidies, direct government expenditures, or fiat credit. Nobody's ever done it because poor people can't afford to pay the level of capital which is required, even with today's technologies, to give themselves access to real power. Yet as I look around most of the countries, and it's not because they're poor. Russia was poor in 1930 and Lenin achieved universal energy access because he prioritized it. These governments are not prioritizing it. That's why the space is the way it is. And it does not seem to me that we are having a piece of social fiction that really makes it clear to these governments that once the business models are developed by the entrepreneurs and once the technologies are developed by the engineers, governments or banks or the World Bank or somebody has got to de-risk the capital.
So, Carl, I would say yes, we are not seeing that happen. But I was before you said that last sentence, I was going to make the point that I think the social fiction has started. In the last few months, we've had conversations with two governments at very high levels, and that social fiction has started. People have added up. These are countries that are not blessed with large reserves of oil, gas, or coal, and they've added up for years the amount it costs them to import and what it means for their security, national security, what it means for their debt. And for the first time, they're seeing alternatives that we were talking about that don't require for you to be born with an oil field under your land, that you can literally build this stuff. And you can literally build it from stuff that is available all around the world. So you don't have to be, a country with a certain reason. So that social fiction I see being written. Now, how long it takes them to act is different. And oddly enough, some of them got there by making a big noise about the amount of electronics that their countries were importing, and saying, here's $500 billion worth of electronics that we're going to import, and now our national debt is going to rise. And then you turn around and say, what about energy? Have you added that number up? And they go, uh-oh, and what that amount is. So I think the social fiction is being written. Obviously, we know that it takes these governments a long time to act.
Those of us who work in energy access space, either at the commercial level or at the household level, are kind of a part of the new Edison culture. There are more people that live off the grid today than there were before there was a grid. So while we were building the grid, there were actually less people in the world than there are people that live off the grid today. And I'm sure somebody smarter than me thought of that, but it just came into my head. My question, though, is the thing that I have seen when you talk about that missing middle. We've created a kind of user-centered design for people who are using kerosene lanterns and paraffin and batteries. And we've seen that the commercial technologies around solar and biomass are available today. But the thing that I have yet to see, and I of course haven't seen everything, people are coming up with new products all the time, are commercial level systems that are market tuned. And do you have anything to share regarding bringing in these larger systems that do productive work? And how are we tuning those to the African market, to the Indian market, to Southeast Asia, in a way that addresses the fact that we may not build the service infrastructure to take care of these more complex systems as quickly as the technology is ready to put it into the market? So around user-centered design for larger systems.
Well, maybe I'll start by saying that what we're seeing is battery, just like solar technology cost has come down and down and down, we're seeing battery cost come down and down and down and get better and better and better. And actually, Depender and the folks at Tesla will know that better than anybody. But I think what that means for the industry is that and what we're already seeing with some of the partners that we're working with, including MCOPA, is that their ability to create much bigger products that go up into the SME or the S&M of SME are increasing. So we're now getting products that are able to serve a small retail shop if they want to set up a cold chain storage for drinks, if they want to set up a sign for their. I think that battery technology cost is going to do a lot of driving, or is going to drive a lot of the growth for that small scale application. But Jasjit's working on a slightly bigger application than that.
And if you could talk about the question of how the adaptation in India, for example, for the biomass, if you could talk a little bit about that.
I think it's a terrific question. So the model is built to be a copy and paste model, but then you tune it to local area requirements. In our specific case, our inputs very easily understood. What's really key for us is R&D that's done on feedstocks, and we look at feedstocks across the range so that in any place you have a tuned plant that can be put in, we have actually patented it, where you take whatever combination of inputs, but the output is a steady, repeatable output. And what that does from an energy perspective is that it adds reliability along with quality and service that you're working on. What it does require is investments in R&D in order for you to do that, and a basic thought process around the business model that you're constructing. You kind of work on it from both sides, from the business model side so that it's locally applicable, and then what's the secret sauce that you have in the business that allows you to copy and paste multiply.
From a technical innovation point of view, just to add to all of that, I think you used an analogy which is very appropriate, which is human interface sort of design, which is a computing analogy. And I think the answer is within that computing history as well, which is just like computing has been revolutionized from having products that are sort of mainframe-like and personal computer-like and tablet-like and cloud-like, you're seeing exactly the same kind of innovation happening in energy. There's the mainframe version, there's the PC version, there's the tablet version, there's the smartphone version, and there's the cloud version. And I mean that literally and figuratively, where that's happening. And the role I think that you will play, that you will see increasingly playing in that is just like in the computing world, which is better storage, better ability to distribute and manage distributed systems, and software plays a role in that as well, along with electronics. So you're seeing innovation in power electronics, you're seeing new materials in power electronics, both of which will help this, and you're seeing huge innovation in storage.
And I just want to add one more quick thing, because we didn't really talk about it, but the security issue by the changing of the model, for example, of not going away from a grid system where you can actually be vulnerable and be also loss of significant revenue if there's no electricity. We saw that with when the power went out in the East Coast of the United States, the grid from Toronto to Ohio all the way down for like 2 days, and also what we just saw with Hurricane Sandy. And what's fascinating is I saw a statistic where if we completely rebuilt the United States grid, we would have saved $2 billion if we would have rebuilt it versus what we lost from the revenue from Sandy and the blackout, I think it's 2002, 2003, which I thought was fascinating because it was like, well, if we just, and then we'd have a whole new grid, but maybe we don't need it. Maybe it's the cloud energy. But I want to get to more questions in the back over there.
I've been supporting Barefoot College for many, many years. And my question to the panel is, well, just for information, Barefoot College has been solar electrifying villages in 49 countries, more than 1,000, by empowering rural women to become solar engineers. So my question to the panel is, what would you suggest to Barefoot College to do better?
Barefoot's highly revered. I mean, they're a good model. Solar, and I like the word solar tears. How about you, Jim? Go ahead and take a stab at that one.
Well, I didn't watch the movie last night because of jet lag, unfortunately. So I mean, it's very critical. Right. If you think about the hundreds of thousands or millions of small villages that you need to reach, right? I mean, the game is about distribution, but not just distribution, but also putting in place some maintenance and financing. So, I guess the question is really, I mean, it's already known, right? But we need hundreds of barefoot colleges, right? And so can barefoot replicate itself so that it can spread faster, right? I mean, we have more than one university in the world, right? Why do we only have one barefoot college, right? We need those in every country.
Yeah. Sir.
Vijay, I'm from the Melinda Foundation. We're an operational foundation based in Paris, working in the Indian Sundarbans on two major projects. One is to do with replacing the diesel rickshaws, which form the public transport system there, with electric vehicles. And since there's no grid connect there, we're doing it with this network of solar charging stations. The other project, which is an offshoot of this, is to provide electrification through solar, through a system of microgrids. I have one observation and one question. One is about what the point there was about governments needing to step in to subsidize that. India's been trying to do that for a very long time now. And I worked in the rural electrification sector as well. And I think in another 5 years from now, every village in India will have a line reaching. But that doesn't transform to access to electricity because the supply-demand gap is very, very huge. We've been growing at maybe over 6-7% over the last 10 years, and though it's slowed down a bit now. But the energy, the growth, energy capacity addition has not kept pace. It's much far behind, something like 3-4%. So there's a very huge gap, and even if we do have the coal, but even if we keep adding at whatever rate we're doing now, the demand supply gap would keep increasing, and that's where people like Jasjit come in. I think that market is very, very big. So that's one part. The second is that there's a question to Jasjit that we are doing electrification through mini grids, microgrids, solar. We've been able to address the segment in as far as household lighting is concerned, schools, institutions, and so on. We'll be able to also address the lighting of the bazaars, the markets which operate for 5-6 hours each evening in those areas. But then the other thing which Dipender was saying about access to refrigeration, a little bit higher kind of things like a village post office, we would possibly be able to address those also with solar. But going beyond that into when you go to things like sawmills, rice mills, dehusking mills, and so on. You require mechanical devices to operate, which require productive power, which solar it'll be difficult to do that. And there are no other systems that can work there. Wind, it's been tried out, it's not worked. Tidal power, not worked. The hybrid systems are not worked. So I just want to ask you whether this biomass, thing is it similar to the Husk power model? Can it be replicated? Do you require feedstock can it be done anywhere, or do you need a particular kind of waste? We want to add on to what we are doing with, some kind of a power like yours, which can operate mechanical systems.
Yeah, I'll give a short answer to that, which is this is marginal bio-waste that we're collecting, but collecting at a very large scale. And then the output product can be it can be across phases and across product types. So you can have solid, liquid, or gaseous output, and you can have either a fuel form or you can convert it to electricity and so forth. These are just all manifestations of energy, even water is. So within that, solid biofuel, to Simon's point, keep it simple. Solid biofuel by itself that goes into grate and fluidized bed boilers is a market that never ends from a solid biofuel perspective. And so that's all that you really need to focus towards. There are crucial differences with the Husk power model. One's on the demand side, which is looking at marginal, not valuable bio-waste, because in economies like India and China and Philippines and so forth, there's value that's attached to ag residue, which otherwise might not be in developed places. So Husk is actually very valuable. It's about $80 a ton. On the other hand, we get paid to collect straw and to collect sugarcane leaves, as an example. So that end of the equation is very important. And the other end of the equation is what form of energy you convert it to. The best of what we know is gasifier technologies converting over into electricity. Efficiencies run at a very low level, in 17, 20, 22% sort of levels. And so it's a transmission loss of a certain type. And why incur that transmission loss? Those are all factors that help drive the efficiency of a model up. But I think the last point I'd make out here is connecting in the Sundarbans area with the sort of NGOs that Jim was talking about. And Anudeep is a terrific NGO that Omidyar Network supports, that I'd be happy to put you in touch with if you'd like.
Yes, sir.
I'm Nader Khatib, Palestinian Director of Prince of Air, Middle East. Solar energy is really very interesting, and we are working on that. But, energy has been a monopoly during the history for certain companies. And all the local laws and systems have been designed in that direction. And there is demand for energy in urban areas. And now it's, to come and replace that, we haven't got the policies and the laws. We need to change it. And we've been struggling for many years, just to approve this feed-in tariff systems. And today, with the current prices, within 5 years, you can achieve full cost recovery. Okay? But we still have problems with the current policies. And these people are very powerful. In some countries, you have nuclear power plants for energy. So how we are going to overcome the existing laws and the competition? We are seen as enemy to these, giant investors. Thank you.
We talked a little bit about that yesterday in terms of the role of government and bigger companies that may have something to lose by these innovations. Simon, you want to take a stab at that one?
You can try. Well, what I would say to that is, to me, one of the biggest drivers, if not the biggest driver of policy, is economics.
Yes.
And if I think about all the countries in the world and their rate of adoption of new technologies, there will be some leading adopters, and there will be some that are going to be coming in last, kicking and screaming. And particularly, I think some of the ones that have a lot to lose in terms of the kind of industry that might need to get disrupted. So to me, I'm less, this is not going to be comfort to you, I think, but I'm less concerned about some of the geographies that are, I think that rather than just fight for policy change for the sake of it, I think the best way to do it is to lead by example. And so if there are companies out there that are showing that they can deliver energy at scale in an economic way, even in the Middle East, that's probably an effective way of affecting change.
I was going to add, if you have some early adapters and there are statistics in regards to education, people are actually going to be able to become employed. It actually saves the government potentially money, or where people actually were so reliant on a very high price point. And depending, again, to your point, economics. If people are seeing that, you might see there might be a greater opportunity for that adaptation versus actually not, people operating in a vacuum trying to hold on to a monopoly, or not allowing the people to have the applications of being off the grid or social impact. What would you say about
Actually,
that?
I mean, Jim can add. We have somebody in the audience who's dealt with policy for many years in this space, and that's Carl, when he ran the Sierra Club.
Carl, would you like to contribute
What do you?
to the answer?
I mean, first of all, to go back to social fiction. You have a conversation in most countries, certainly in mine, and I don't know what happens in Israel and Jordan, in the West Bank, but a conversation in which people talk about energy markets which actually don't exist. What we have in many cases is energy monopolies. Trying to decide whether electricity is subsidized is extraordinarily difficult, at least in the United States, because you don't really know what the real price is. There was a deal made a long time ago where a monopoly utility had to assume reliability risk, and in exchange it got paid really high rents. But if you can disrupt, I mean, if we take Clayton Christensen's theory of how you make disruption work, what you have to find is customers that the monopoly is not serving.
Exactly. Yes.
And in certainly many countries, there are a lot of customers the monopolies are not serving. And focus on the customers the monopoly is not serving, because then you have a power base and a market of your own from which you can then disrupt the monopoly. But I actually think thinking about the economics is probably going to be more effective at breaking monopolies than lobbying governments, although at the end of the day, I lobbied governments for my whole life, and I got a fair amount done. But it was a lot faster when I had an economic tailwind instead of an economic headwind.
It's really interesting because when you talk about solar in the Philippines, in the press and everything else, it's always, at the end, it's about feed-in tariffs, right? And people getting displaced by this, and subsidies and whatever. And so it just doesn't go anywhere. And they keep talking, and they'll continue to talk, right? In the meantime, when we talk about distributed power, it's to places that don't have electricity. So these are not their customers. We're not displacing anything on the grid. We're serving new needs that are not currently being served.
But in any monopoly, you might actually want those customers later.
Well, but actually what happens is,
Right.
like in the Philippines, every area is covered by an electric cooperative, right? And they love us. Why do they love us? Because these customers have been complaining for decades. Why aren't they getting, power? And so now they can say, well, actually, why don't you go talk to Jim and you can get light, right? So,
So you're very busy when you get down there.
well, so it's actually very, so they don't quite see it coming at this point. Right now, we're solving a particular need for them, right? And as we build it, if we start getting it into microgrids, et cetera, you build it to be grid ready, right? But I'm not even sure that it will get to that point, because a lot of the capacity will continue to be off-grid, just like cell phones versus landlines. Where I think actually where we need help is to get governments and utilities looking at this from with the same paradigm, with a paradigm that will enable this industry to develop properly over time. Our biggest problem is we keep going into markets that have been really destroyed by poor policies of the governments working with the Department of Energy and the aid agencies, right, coming in, where basically it was, let's give it for free, let's bid it out so we get the cheapest stuff, right, without thinking about what maintenance is, and so when we started, we went and talked to the rural banks, and because financing is very critical, and most of them said, we really don't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole, because some of my guys, their job, I took them from these banks, and they used to collect units that had gone broken, and they had stopped paying the banks, and they were just repoing the units. Right, and so that's what makes life hard. And then when you give it away for free, then people say, well, I want a free unit. Why should I pay for it? So,
the question, sir.
I've lost my voice. So I have a question for Simon. I completely agree with you about the innovations that are needed on financial structures, and also to Jasjit on innovations that are needed in terms of behavioral hooks and interesting business models. Who do you see as the community of people who are going to actually be this innovative? Because the people who are in the position to do it are not known for their innovative thinking?
It's a great question, and it's actually part of my job to find where some of that innovation is happening. And in our experience, it has come from all over the place. I think there are hubs like Silicon Valley, parts of India where you have pockets of innovation, but we see ideas coming from all over the world. And now that we're living in that world where anybody can share anything with anybody at any time, I think a lot of the innovation is probably going to come where we least expect it. It's going to come from places like China and Nairobi. And I think we're moving very quickly to a world away from this north-south tech transfer to a world where the solutions for this social fiction that will happen is going to come from more of a south-south transfer. So I think, to me, where I'm interested in looking for the innovations are the BRICS, are the countries in Africa where people, historically have never thought of looking for entrepreneurial solutions.
Building on that, these questions, when you talked recently, I thought you were talking about my country. I come from France, and in France, just last year, 230,000 households went off grid because they just couldn't pay the bill. So, is there any example or insight that you have around reverse innovation, where it doesn't just go from south to south, but also from south to north? Do you have an example or?
You can have
Mike?
the same technology, but in different use cases, right? These lanterns that we were talking about turning into very popular camping devices, etc. So it's a different use case. And the sorts of plants that we look at to the customization question earlier applies equally well to corn stover, which is at extreme volume.
So Mike has a product that they're distributing in Africa, which is a very cool designed cell phone charger, think of it like the Apple device for cell phone charging using solar. And I think a few months back you launched the American product, and post Sandy you sold a lot, right? And it was completely developed in Africa.
But I must say, I went to Intersolar in Munich a few years ago. It's the biggest solar thing. I think they must have had 9 football fields of provide about 6,000 providers, and I went around and I saw 2 who were working on off-grid. Everyone else was selling stuff for the feed-in market, right? And so I think until kind of that paradigm shifts, right? I mean, there's a lot of technology, but it's really the paradigm of how do you use the technology in a different context. And it was very interesting when you see all of these power outages with Sandy and et cetera, and people moaning about having a week of no power, right? From where we come from, that's normal, right? And so clearly, that dependence, right? And you just get used to having it all the time, and then you forget like what it means not to have it. So
we have to wrap quickly, and but I wanted to leave with just a little story which talks about energy and actually impacting commerce in a different way. I don't know if people were at TED this year, but there was a TED Talk by a 13-year-old boy from Africa who was there. First time he ever got on a plane was to fly to TED. And what he did was he actually dismantled his mom's radio and built a solar lighting system because it would, in his opinion, distract the lions from eating the cows. Mm-hmm. He just had this theory. And all of a sudden, one day after he put it out, there was these Christmas lights. Through solar, a little solar thing, he connected it, just learned how to do it himself. These things are flickering, and all of a sudden the lions weren't coming to eat the cows from the family, and the woman down the street asked him how to do it. She did it herself in the small rural town, and you're having this sort of this natural expansion of an idea, which was just completely, by in a way accidental, using solar, using the mom's radio, and then of course, having the not such an impact on their home economic because of a new energy source that just came out of nowhere. And so I just felt like when you say that, in terms of like feeding up this type of innovations that you're able to be applied that have these effects that people didn't even think about. And that's really what's fascinating too, is that the applications is what you think is going to happen, and then of course the causality and people utilizing it in new ways that nobody could have actually predicted, which actually are the ones that actually drive the markets. So, but anyway, I just wanted to, again, thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate it to the panelists. Thank you. Thank you very much.